In the early 1960s, American entertainment was at a turning point. Television was changing how people consumed music. Hollywood was producing films at a rapid pace. And right in the middle of all of this were two people who had already managed to capture the attention of millions: Elvis Presley and Ann-Margret. They came from different backgrounds, had taken different roads to fame, and represented different things to the public. But when their paths finally crossed, something happened that neither of them had planned for, and that no one around them could quite explain. Elvis Presley did not need an introduction by 1963. He had already spent nearly a decade reshaping American music. From the moment his first records came out on Sun Records in Memphis in the mid-1950s, people knew they were hearing something new. His voice had a quality that was hard to describe. It could be soft and gentle in one moment and raw and powerful in the next. He could sing gospel, country, blues, and pop, and he made each one feel completely natural. By the time he appeared on national television and sent audiences into a frenzy, he had become more than a singer. He had become a symbol of a whole generation finding its voice. But fame at that level comes with a cost. By the early 1960s, Elvis was no longer just a musician making records. He was a product. His manager, Colonel Tom Parker, had built a machine around him: movies, merchandise, carefully managed public appearances. Elvis was making films regularly, and while some of them had genuine moments, most were designed to be safe, commercial, and predictable. They were vehicles for soundtrack albums, not serious acting work. Elvis knew this. People close to him knew this. But the machine kept moving and Elvis stayed inside it. Away from the cameras, Elvis was a more complicated person than his public image suggested. People who spent time with him talked about his curiosity, his humor, and his genuine warmth. He read widely, was interested in spirituality and philosophy, and had a deep emotional connection to music that went far beyond performing for crowds. He had grown up poor in Tupelo, Mississippi, and had never quite lost a sense of gratitude and disbelief that came with having risen so far so fast. Those who knew him well said that the real Elvis, the one who sat at the piano late at night and played for hours with no audience, was different from the polished star that the world saw on movie posters. Ann-Margret was a different kind of story. Born in Sweden in 1941, she had moved to the United States as a child and grown up in Illinois. From a young age, it was clear that she had something: a natural energy, a comfort in front of an audience, and a voice that carried genuine emotion. She studied performance, worked hard at her craft, and by the early 1960s had broken through in a significant way. Her appearance on the Jack Benny television program had opened doors, and her film career was gaining real momentum. She was being noticed not just as a pretty face, but as someone with actual talent, someone who could sing, dance, and act with equal confidence. What made Ann-Margret stand out in a Hollywood full of beautiful women was exactly that combination. She was not simply cast for her looks. She brought a physical energy to her performances that was unusual for female stars of that era. On stage and on screen, she moved like someone who genuinely loved performing, not like someone going through choreography. And like Elvis, her relationship with music was personal. It was not just a career tool, it was something she felt. When the two of them were cast together in Viva Las Vegas, the people who made that decision were primarily thinking about box office numbers. Elvis was a draw, Ann-Margret was a rising name. Put them together in a fun, colorful film set in Las Vegas, add some songs, and audiences would show up. That was the calculation. Nobody was thinking about what might happen when two people who both grew up loving music, who both had that rare ability to lose themselves in a song, ended up in the same room together. But that is exactly what happened. And it started, as so many real moments do, not on a stage or in front of a camera, but quietly at a piano, when no one was expecting anything at all. When production began on Viva Las Vegas in 1963, it looked on the surface like any other Elvis Presley film of that era. The formula was familiar: a late story, a glamorous location, a collection of songs, and Elvis at the center of it all. MGM had done this kind of film before, and so had Elvis. The studio knew what sold tickets, and for the most of the early 1960s, that formula had worked well enough. But Viva Las Vegas turned out to be different from the moment filming began, and the reason for that difference had a name: Ann-Margret. Las Vegas in 1963 was not the massive resort city it would eventually become, but it was already a place with its own energy. The hotels were grand, the lights were bright, and there was a constant sense of excitement in the air. For a film production, it was an ideal backdrop, visually interesting, full of life, and unlike anywhere else in America. The crew arrived, the sets were prepared, and the cameras began rolling on what was supposed to be a straightforward commercial project. Nobody on the MGM lot was expecting anything unusual to come out of it. Elvis arrived on set already a veteran of the Hollywood system. By 1963, he had made more than 10 films, and he understood how the process worked. He showed up, he learned his lines, he performed the songs, and he was generally professional and easy to work with. People who worked with him on various productions over the years consistently described him as polite, punctual, and generous with the crew. He was not the kind of star who made demands or created problems. But those same people also noted that Elvis rarely seemed fully engaged in his film work. He did what was required, but there was a sense that part of him was elsewhere, that the movies were a job, not a passion. That changed on Viva Las Vegas. From the first days of production, people on set noticed something different about Elvis. He was more present, more focused, and more genuinely interested in what was happening around him. The reason became clear quickly. Ann-Margret had arrived on set, and she was not like the other actresses Elvis had worked with. Ann-Margret came prepared. She had done her work, knew her character, and brought an energy to the set that was immediate and noticeable. But beyond professionalism, she brought something harder to define: a genuine spark. She wasn't performing enthusiasm. She was actually enthusiastic. She loved being on set, loved the music, loved the movement and the choreography, and the whole process of making something come to life on camera. That attitude was contagious, and Elvis felt it. The director of Viva Las Vegas was George Sidney, a veteran filmmaker who had worked with major stars throughout his career. Sidney recognized early on that what was happening between his two leads was not something he had planned for. The chemistry between Elvis and Ann-Margret was visible from their first scenes together. It was not manufactured or forced. When they were in the same frame, something shifted. The scenes had a different quality, more natural, more alive, more watchable than the typical Elvis film output of that period. The film story followed Elvis as Lucky Jackson, a race car driver trying to raise money to compete in the Las Vegas Grand Prix. Ann-Margret played Rusty Martin, a swimming instructor who becomes the object of his attention. On paper, it was a simple romantic storyline built around musical numbers and light comedy. But on screen, because of the two people inhabiting those roles, it became something more. Their scenes together had a back-and-forth quality, neither one dominating, both genuinely responding to the other, that gave the film an energy that Elvis's other movies simply did not have. The crew noticed it. The producers noticed it. George Sidney, who had every reason to keep things moving efficiently and on schedule, found himself slowing down for their scenes, allowing more takes, exploring different angles, because what was happening in front of the camera was worth capturing carefully. People who were present during production later recalled that when Elvis and Ann-Margret were on set together, there was a different atmosphere. People paid attention in a different way. Part of what made it work was that Ann-Margret didn't treat Elvis like a legend. She treated him like a coworker, a talented one, someone she respected, but a person she could talk to and work with as an equal. For Elvis, who spent most of his professional life surrounded by people who either worshipped him or wanted something from him, that was genuinely refreshing. And it was in that atmosphere, relaxed, creative, and unexpectedly honest, that the two of them sat down at a piano together for the first time. There were moments in life that nobody plans for. They happen in between the scheduled things, in the quiet gaps where nobody is watching too closely and nobody is performing for anyone. The piano moment between Elvis Presley and Ann-Margret was exactly that kind of moment. It did not happen during a rehearsal that had been carefully arranged. It did not happen in front of cameras with a director calling the shots. It happened naturally, the way real things tend to happen, without warning, without a script, and without anyone fully understanding what they were witnessing until it was already over. By the time production on Viva Las Vegas was well underway, Elvis and Ann-Margret had already developed a comfortable working relationship. They had run lines together, rehearsed choreography, and spent enough time on set to move past the initial politeness that comes with meeting someone new. There was an ease between them that people around them had already begun to notice. But ease between co-stars is not unusual. What happened at the piano was something different. Elvis had always had a natural relationship with the piano. Long before he became famous as a guitar-driven rock and roll performer, the piano had been a constant in his life. He had grown up around gospel music, and gospel lives at the piano. He was not a trained pianist in any formal sense. He had never taken lessons or studied theory, but he played with a feeling that more technically accomplished musicians often lack. For Elvis, sitting down at a piano was never about showing off. It was about finding something. It was a way of thinking through music, of letting whatever was inside him come out without the pressure of a performance. On this particular day during filming, Elvis sat down at a piano that was on or near the set. The details vary slightly depending on who is telling the story, but the core of what happened is consistent across multiple accounts. He began to play. Nothing structured, nothing from the film's soundtrack, just whatever his hands found. Ann-Margret was nearby. She heard him playing and came closer. And then, without any formal invitation or arrangement, she joined in. What followed was not a rehearsed duet. It was not a planned musical moment designed to build their on-screen chemistry for the cameras. It was two people who both genuinely loved music sitting together and discovering that they were speaking the same language. Elvis would play something and Ann-Margret would follow it instinctively. She would add a vocal line and he would respond to it. They moved through different feels, sometimes bluesy, sometimes softer and more melodic, and at no point did either of them seem to be thinking about what they were doing. They were simply doing it. People who were present said that the room changed when it started. Crew members who had been busy with their own work slowed down and stopped. Conversations that had been happening nearby went quiet. Nobody made a deliberate decision to stop and watch. It just happened, because what was coming from that piano was the kind of thing that pulls people toward it without asking permission. There was nothing showy about it. That was precisely what made it so striking. Ann-Margret had grown up with music in a serious way. She had performed from a young age and had developed a genuine musicality that went beyond simply having a good voice. She could listen and respond, which is actually a rare skill. Many performers are so focused on their own output that they stop receiving what is coming from the other person. Ann-Margret did not have that problem. She heard Elvis, not just the notes he was playing, but the feeling behind them, and she answered it honestly. For Elvis, the experience was significant in a specific way. He had spent years surrounded by people who agreed with everything he did, who applauded whatever he produced, who were not going to push back or contribute something unexpected. Ann-Margret at that piano was not agreeing with him, she was participating with him. She was adding something of her own, something that changed what he was playing and made it into something neither of them would have arrived at alone. That kind of musical conversation was not something Elvis experienced often, and people who knew him said it mattered to him deeply. The moment did not last for hours. It was not some extended cinematic event. It was a relatively brief exchange, but brief does not mean small. What it established between them was real. It confirmed something that the film set had been hinting at, that this was not just professional compatibility, this was two people who connected in a place that was deeper than conversation or even shared experience. They connected through music, which for both of them was the most honest language they had. Everyone in that room felt it, and nobody who was there forgot it. When a film wraps and the crew goes home, most professional relationships end there. People move on to the next project, the next city, the next set of coworkers. Hollywood is full of on-set connections that feel significant in the moment and then dissolve completely once the cameras stop rolling. What happened between Elvis and Ann-Margret after the piano moment was not that. What developed between them during and after the filming of Viva Las Vegas was something that neither of them had been looking for, and neither of them could easily explain. A genuine, real human connection that lasted long after the movie was finished and the reviews were written. It started on set, in the spaces between takes and rehearsals. Elvis and Ann-Margret began spending time together that had nothing to do with the film. They talked, really talked, the kind of conversations that go past surface pleasantries and into actual territory. People who were around them during production noted that the two of them seemed to find each other's company genuinely comfortable. There was no performance involved when they were together off camera. They were not two stars maintaining their public images in each other's presence. They were two people who happened to enjoy being around each other. One of the most talked about details from this period was the motorcycles. Elvis loved riding motorcycles. It was one of the few things in his life that gave him a genuine sense of freedom. The open road, the speed, the simplicity of it. Ann-Margret, it turned out, shared that love. She was not someone who had taken up motorcycles to impress him or to find common ground. She had her own history with them, her own comfort on a bike. When the two of them rode together during the production period, it was not a publicity stunt or a manufactured moment. It was just two people who liked the same thing, doing that thing together. They got matching motorcycles. That detail has been repeated many times over the years. And it matters not because of what it looks like from the outside, though it does paint the clear picture, but because of what it says about where their relationship had gone. Matching motorcycles are not something you arrange with someone you are simply friendly with on set. They are a statement, even if it is a quiet one. They are a way of saying, this matters, and I want something to mark it. The phone calls were another layer of the same thing. After filming wrapped and both of them returned to their separate lives and separate careers, they stayed in contact. Elvis called Ann-Margret regularly. She called him. Their conversations were not brief check-ins. People who were aware of these calls, members of Elvis's inner circle, people who spent time around him at Graceland, described them as long, relaxed, and genuinely warm. Elvis did not make those kinds of calls casually. He was not a person who maintained connections out of obligation. If he was calling, it was because he wanted to. Ann-Margret has spoken about Elvis over the years with a consistency and a care that says more than any single quote could. She has never sensationalized what happened between them. She has never used their connection to attract attention or to position herself in a certain way publicly. When she talks about him, she talks about who he actually was, his humor, his kindness, his sensitivity, the way he made people feel when he was paying attention to them. Those are not the observations of someone looking back on a professional relationship. Those are the observations of someone who knew a person. What made their connection unusual in the context of Elvis's life was the equality of it. Ann-Margret was not part of his world. She had her own career, her own circle, her own identity that existed completely independently of him. She did not need anything from Elvis Presley. She was not trying to get closer to his fame or his influence. She came to him as herself, and he responded to that in a way that people around him recognized as different from his usual dynamic with people. Elvis had grown up fast and had been surrounded since his early 20s by a group of friends and employees who became known as the Memphis Mafia. Loyal, devoted, and largely unwilling to challenge him or bring an outside perspective into his life. Ann-Margret was outside all of that. She saw him without the framework that most people brought to an encounter with Elvis Presley, and he, in turn, could be with her in a way that felt more natural and less managed than most of his relationships. Their connection was real. It was also complicated because real things in Elvis's life had a way of running into the walls that had been built around him. But for a period of time, what existed between them was as genuine as anything in his life during those years. And that genuineness never fully went away, even when everything else changed. There is a difference between two people performing together and two people actually making music together. The first is a technical exercise, coordination, timing, hitting the right notes at the right moments. The second is something else entirely. It requires a kind of listening that goes beyond simply waiting for your cue. It requires sensitivity to what the other person is doing, a willingness to adjust and respond in real time, and enough trust to let the music go somewhere unexpected without trying to control it. Elvis Presley and Ann-Margret had that second thing, and it showed up every time they were in front of a microphone or a camera together. To understand why their musical chemistry was so unusual, it helps to understand what each of them brought to music individually. Elvis was not a trained vocalist in the classical sense. He had never studied technique in any formal way. What he had instead was something that training alone cannot produce: an instinct for feeling. He understood, almost without thinking about it, where the emotion in a song lived. He knew when to push and when to pull back, when to let a note breathe and when to drive through it. His voice was an instrument that responded to what he was feeling, which is why his best recordings never sound mechanical. They sound like someone actually experiencing something. Ann-Margret brought a different but complementary set of qualities. She had worked hard at her craft and had developed a technical control that Elvis lacked in the formal sense, but she also had something beyond technique: a rawness, an expressiveness, a willingness to be vulnerable in a song that matched Elvis's emotional openness in an interesting way. Where Elvis followed his instincts, Ann-Margret combined instinct with discipline. Where he was spontaneous, she was precise without being cold. Together, those qualities balanced each other in a way that neither of them could have predicted. When they performed together on screen in Viva Las Vegas, the musical numbers had a quality that stood apart from anything else in Elvis's film catalog. The most obvious example is their performances together in the film itself. The energy, the responsiveness, the way they seemed to be genuinely reacting to each other rather than simply executing choreography. Audiences felt this even without being able to articulate exactly what they were responding to. The scenes with Ann-Margret consistently had more life than the scenes without her, and a significant part of that was musical. Their voices blended in a way that was genuinely surprising. Elvis had a naturally deep, rich voice with a wide range. Ann-Margret had a voice that was bright and forward, with a warmth in the middle register that could hold its own against a stronger sound without being overwhelmed by it. When they sang together, neither voice disappeared into the other. They remained distinct, which is what makes a real harmony work. True harmony is not about one voice supporting another. It is about two voices creating something that exists between them, something that neither could produce alone. That is what Elvis and Ann-Margret produced when they sang together. People who worked on the musical recordings for the film noted the ease with which the two of them found each other in the studio. There was very little of the usual back and forth that comes with establishing how two voices are going to work together. They seemed to locate the right balance quickly and naturally, as if they had been singing together for years rather than having just met. Sound engineers and producers who were present during the recording sessions commented on how little adjustment was needed, how the blend happened almost on its own. Beyond the technical side, what made their musical connection meaningful was what it communicated emotionally. When Elvis sang with Ann-Margret, he sang differently. People who had spent years listening to his recordings and watching him perform noticed the quality in his voice during those sessions that was not always present in his solo work of that period. He sounded more engaged, more present, more genuinely invested in the material. Ann-Margret brought something out of him musically that the standard formula of his film productions had been gradually suppressing. For Ann-Margret, the experience was equally significant. She has described singing with Elvis as one of the most natural musical experiences of her career. Not because it was easy in a simple sense, but because it felt honest. There was no gap between what she was feeling and what she was producing. The music was something she was delivering. It was something that was happening to her and through her at the same time. That quality, music as something that happens rather than something that is performed, is the rarest thing in any artist's career. Elvis had it on his own, and Margaret had it on her own. When they were together, it doubled, and the result was something that people in that studio and on that film set recognized immediately as special. Two voices finding one sound, naturally, honestly, and completely without effort. Some connections are genuine and still do not survive, not because the people involved stop caring and not because something goes wrong in a dramatic or obvious way, but because the world around those people has its own logic and its own demands. And sometimes those demands are stronger than what two individuals feel for each other. That was the situation with Elvis Presley and Ann-Margret. What existed between them was real, but real was not always enough when it came to Elvis's life, because Elvis's life was not entirely his own. To understand why their relationship could not continue in the way it had developed during Viva Las Vegas, you have to understand the structure that surrounded Elvis at that time. By 1963, Colonel Tom Parker had been managing Elvis for nearly a decade, and in that time he had built something that was less a career and more a carefully controlled operation. Parker was not a traditional music manager in the way the term is understood today. He was a strategist, a promoter, and above all, a controller. He understood Elvis's commercial value with great precision, and he protected that value with an intensity that left very little room for anything he had not approved or planned. Parker's concern about Elvis's public image was constant. Elvis was sold to the public as someone who belonged to his fans, accessible, unattached in the romantic sense, the object of millions of people's affection. That image had commercial value. A settled, publicly committed Elvis was a different kind of product, and Parker was not interested in that product. Every element of Elvis's public life was filtered through that concern, and his personal relationships were no exception. When the connection with Ann-Margret became visible enough to attract public attention, Parker took notice. The press had already started writing about Elvis and Ann-Margret in ways that went beyond standard co-star coverage. Reporters on the set and entertainment journalists of the time picked up on the chemistry between them and began speculating openly about the nature of their relationship. Ann-Margret herself gave an interview during this period in which she spoke about Elvis warmly and in terms that suggested a closeness beyond friendship. The interview caused immediate problems. Parker moved quickly, and Elvis, caught between what he felt and what his professional world required, found himself in a position he did not know how to navigate cleanly. Then there was Priscilla. Priscilla Bewley had been part of Elvis's life since 1959, when he met her while stationed in Germany during his army service. She was 14 at the time, and he was 24. Over the years that followed, their relationship had continued and deepened, with Priscilla eventually moving to Memphis and living at Graceland under the supervision of Elvis's father. By the time Viva Las Vegas was being filmed, Priscilla was a consistent presence in Elvis's life and his household. Their relationship was not public in the way a formal engagement would have been, but it was known to those around him, and it carried weight. Elvis's situation was genuinely complicated in the way that simple descriptions do not capture. He had real feelings for Ann-Margret. He also had a long and deeply rooted connection to Priscilla. He was surrounded by a management structure that had opinions about both, and he was operating inside a public image that had been constructed over years and that carried financial and professional consequences if it shifted too dramatically. None of those things were going away, and they all pulled in different directions. Ann-Margret, for her part, handled the situation with a dignity that said a great deal about her character. She did not push for something that was not available to her. She did not make public statements designed to pressure Elvis or create a narrative that served her interests. She understood on some level the complexity of what she had stepped into, and she chose to respond to it honestly rather than strategically. That, too, was part of who she was. The pulling apart was gradual rather than sudden. There was no single moment of rupture, no dramatic confrontation that ended things cleanly. What happened instead was the slow reestablishment of the boundaries that Elvis's life required. The phone calls became less frequent. The proximity that filming had created gave way to the distance of separate careers moving in separate directions. Elvis moved forward with his life, and eventually he and Priscilla were married in 1967. But the end of a romantic chapter is not the end of a human connection. What Elvis and Ann-Margret had built between them did not simply disappear because circumstances required them to move apart. It changed form, settled into something quieter, and continued in ways that would only become fully visible much later. Some things do not end. They just find a different way to continue. There is a particular kind of relationship that does not fit neatly into the categories people usually use. It is not a friendship in the ordinary sense, and it is not a romance, and it is not simply a professional connection. It is something that forms between two people who have seen each other clearly, who have shared something genuine, and who carry that with them even when life moves them in completely different directions. That is what Elvis Presley and Ann-Margret had in the years after Viva Las Vegas. The romantic chapter closed, but what remained was something steady and consistent that neither of them ever dismissed or minimized. It showed up in small gestures and in significant moments, and it lasted until the very end of Elvis's life. One of the most well-known expressions of this ongoing connection was the flowers. Every time something significant happened in Ann-Margret's professional life, an opening night, a new show, a major performance, Elvis sent flowers. Not once or twice, but consistently, year after year. He tracked what she was doing and made sure she knew he was aware of it. For someone like Elvis, whose schedule was relentless and whose personal life was constantly managed and crowded, that kind of sustained attention was not a small thing. It required intention. It required that he actually cared enough to remember and to act on that memory every single time. Ann-Margret has spoken about those flowers in interviews over the years, and what she says about them is telling. She does not describe them as grand, romantic gestures. She describes them as something warmer and more personal than that, as evidence that Elvis was paying attention to her life and wanted her to know it. In the entertainment world, where relationships are often transactional and attention tends to follow relevance, that kind of consistent, quiet acknowledgement meant something real. It was not about maintaining a public image or keeping a connection alive for strategic reasons. It was simply Elvis being the kind of person he actually was when nobody was watching. The flowers also moved in the other direction. When Ann-Margret was seriously injured in 1972, she fell from a platform during a performance in Lake Tahoe and suffered significant injuries, including a broken cheekbone and a broken arm. Elvis responded immediately. He was in contact, he sent flowers, and he made sure she knew he was thinking of her during her recovery. People around Elvis noted how genuinely concerned he was. This was not a public response designed to look good in the press. It happened in private, between two people who cared about each other across whatever distance their lives had created. Their professional worlds occasionally brought them back into proximity during the 1970s, and when that happened, the ease between them was still there. People who witnessed their interactions during this period described a comfort and a warmth that was immediately visible. There was no awkwardness, no navigating around an uncomfortable history. What there was, instead, was the kind of relaxed familiarity that comes from having truly known someone, from having been seen in an unguarded moment and having been seen in return. Elvis's close associates were aware of what Ann-Margret meant to Elvis. Members of his inner circle from that period have spoken about the fact that she occupied a specific place in his life that was different from almost anyone else. She was not part of the Graceland world, not part of the Memphis Mafia, not someone whose relationship with him had been shaped by proximity and dependence. She was someone from outside that world who had known him as a person rather than a figure, and that distinction mattered to Elvis in ways that he did not always have the words to express. Then came August 1977. Elvis Presley died at Graceland on August 16th at the age of 42. The news reached the world quickly, and the response was overwhelming. Fans gathered outside Graceland in enormous numbers. Tributes came from across the entertainment industry, and the coverage was constant and extensive. In the middle of all of that public mourning, Ann-Margret made a quiet and personal decision. She attended his funeral. She did not make a statement about it. She did not position herself prominently or seek attention for being there. She came because she wanted to be there, because it was the right thing to do for someone who had mattered to her, and because the flowers and the phone calls and the years of quiet connection had added up to something that deserved to be honored in person. Her presence at that funeral said more than any public tribute could have. Those who noticed her there understood what it meant. This was not a co-star paying respects to a famous colleague. This was someone saying goodbye to a person she genuinely knew and genuinely cared about. The distinction was visible to anyone paying close enough attention. What Elvis and Ann-Margret had was never loud. It never needed to be. It was built on something quiet and honest, and it held that character all the way to the end. When people look back at the story of Elvis Presley and Ann-Margret, the tendency is to focus on the romance, the chemistry on screen, the matching motorcycles, the relationship that developed and then could not continue. That is a natural way to approach the story, because romance is easy to understand and easy to tell. But if you stop there, you miss the deeper thing that their connection was actually about. The piano moment that started everything was not primarily a romantic moment, it was a musical one. And what it revealed about both of them individually and about what happened when they were together says something important about who Elvis Presley really was beneath the image that the world had built around him. Elvis spent most of his professional life being told what to do with his talent. Colonel Tom Parker decided where he performed and when. The film studios decided what roles he played and what songs he recorded for the soundtracks. The commercial machinery that had grown up around him since the late 1950s was extraordinarily good at producing a product called Elvis Presley, but it was not particularly interested in what Elvis Presley, the actual human being, wanted to do with his music. By the time Viva Las Vegas was being filmed, there was a growing gap between the artist Elvis was and the product Elvis had become. Most people around him either did not see that gap or did not feel in a position to address it. Ann-Margret saw it, not because she was looking for it, and not because she had any particular insight into the music industry or Elvis's specific situation. She saw it because she was present with him in an honest way. An honest presence has a way of revealing things that managed distance keeps hidden. When she sat down at that piano with him and they began to play together, she was not interacting with Elvis Presley the star. She was interacting with Elvis the musician, the person who had grown up loving gospel and blues, who played piano late at night for no audience, who felt music as something personal and private before it ever became something public and profitable. That version of Elvis, the one who existed before the machinery took over, was the one that the piano moment brought back to the surface. And it mattered, because by 1963, that version of Elvis did not get very many opportunities to show up. The film schedule was relentless, the soundtrack albums were calculated, the performances were staged and managed. There were very few spaces left in Elvis's professional life where he could simply play music because he wanted to and see where it went. Ann-Margret, without planning or trying, created one of those spaces, and what came out of it was enough to stop everyone in the room. This is what the piano moment really meant. It was not just the beginning of a personal connection between two people, though it was that too. It was a moment in which Elvis's real musical self came through clearly and was met by someone who could receive it and respond to it honestly. That kind of meeting is rare for anyone. For someone in Elvis's position, surrounded by yes men, managed within an inch of his creative life, performing to expectations rather than instincts, it was rarer still. Ann-Margret gave him something that afternoon that his professional world was not giving him. She gave him a genuine musical conversation. The fact that their connection lasted, in its quiet, consistent way, for the rest of Elvis's life is not a footnote to the piano story. It is the conclusion of it. Elvis kept sending flowers. He kept making phone calls. He paid attention to Ann-Margret's life and career in a way that was sustained and genuine across more than a decade. That kind of staying power does not come from a film set romance. It comes from something that went deeper than that. From a moment of real recognition between two people who both understood, at a level below words, what music actually was and what it was for. Ann-Margret understood it as expression, as the most honest form of communication available to a performer who had something real inside them to communicate. Elvis understood it the same way. They found each other in that understanding, at a piano, on a film set in 1963, when nobody had planned for anything significant to happen. What they left behind is not just a story about two famous people who had a connection. It is a story about what happens when someone who has been performing for the world finally gets to play for a person, just one person, sitting close, actually listening. For Elvis, that moment was a reminder of why he had fallen in love with music in the first place, long before the world had anything to say about it. That is what the piano meant, and that is why nobody in that room forgot it.